All right, the second part of our exploration of melodic black metal in Redux is concerned with 1992, essentially. And I'll reiterate the point of this is a study group. It's a communal thing. It's not meant to decide what is what subgenre or what is another. We're looking for the origins of melodic black metal, and we're being very thorough about it. This means that these are not all black metal records. We're not looking for the purity of black metal at all. We're looking for the origins of and the evolution of melodic black metal. And this is not some puritanical exploration where we are out to be the inquisition for what is melodic black metal or what isn't black metal at all. So I wanted to get that point out right there, is that if we look at 1992, there was melody in Dark Throne Immortal Emperor's music. Master's Hammer, Belial, Samael, Mystifier, all these bands certainly had melody as part of what they were doing. And more, I'd like to get an idea of what was considered separate, what scenes were available, and look at where black metal was in 1992, while we explore a lot of the origins that were still considered part of death metal. We're still talking about melodic black death metal, or just blackened death metal, as we step into 1992. Although we find different forms of melody in extreme metal forming in profound ways here and there. I think one of the bands that is just interesting to talk about is Elastis. And this band is linked to Samael through a death metal band they played with, but this was distinctly more of a black metal band that we would call dark metal later on. And so if you're a fan of bands like Sadness, Catatonia, or other groups like that, we find that counts a bit. And we'll talk more about Catatonia in one of these entries, because they're related, because we get to experience the gray area of what the band consider themselves and how that might not be how history agreed with them. So with that said, we step into another death metal band, and these guys are from a little bit further north in Sweden, and they were originally known as Necrophobic. They were definitely on the more of the leaning towards the more Slayer-influenced death metal sound. They certainly had some deicide in their songwriting, but by the time they started this, it was clear that they'd been working with John from Dissection and formed their own sound here under the name Decameron. Now, this seemed to be a very clear, maybe it was a name change, it was an evolution of what they were doing, maybe they were getting more serious, but it felt like they're transitioning into black death metal. And I would say that's not all that clear on this demo. This is much more of a death metal demo. It's a very good one, and I really like this band quite a bit. But what we're doing here is introducing their sound and showing how the influence of Dissection spread directly with the bands that they were working with. And there's even a song here co-written by John Nodvite, who you'll see his influence in the song. You'll also see some of the deicide influences again and whatnot as you listen to this demo. So we'll cut to a clip of that just to give you an idea, to introduce the band and kind of get an idea of where they were coming from once their debut came out on No Fashion some years later. So Dawn is an interesting band because where they started was much in the same regard as where a lot of bands like Dissection, Unanimated, and whatnot began, as a death metal band, and a fairly brutal death metal band that isn't particularly romanticist or anything. This is just a very impressive, very aggressive death metal band who've also pulled in some of those thrash and pure death metal, Florida death metal influences into this hard-ass death metal record. I think that's the way to put it, is these guys just really are an exemplar showing of what Swedish death metal was outside of Entombed and Dismember and all that. There was a different side to Swedish death metal, and I think that it's interesting that Dawn were part of this type of sound early on, and that evolved into melodic black death metal, or black metal, or however you'd see it. I would say, well, we'll get there with their discography. For now, we're just seeing where they began. This is an origin for the band, and it's a great one. It's kind of like, I compare the vocal performances to like Molested from Norway, and there is a certain brutality to their work that translates to a lot of early Norwegian stuff in that style when they were still doing death metal. So Pretty interesting demo to check out. It doesn't quite relate to melodic black metal quite yet, but we do get some atmosphere, and we get the beginnings of this band who were important to it. So for those of you jumping ahead and getting ready to talk about dissection until your face turns blue, relax. So this whole exploration is not about dissection, and we're not suggesting that this is the starting point for melodic black metal. It's just that this demo tape was very influential and important in terms of getting them onto a record label. It was very important in doing what a lot of other bands were doing on their tapes who weren't getting signed for it yet. So there's a very fine result here that is very impressive, and in that sense, we're getting something more than what Decameron were doing on their quite sophisticated first demo. We're getting something more sophisticated than Eucharist's first demo even. Above all else, this is just a very impressive showing of songwriting, of guitar work, of harmonization, of use of melody, and also it's a death metal sound just as well. So that melodic black death metal sound does officially arrive on this tape per the Swedish style, but it's not the only version of it even within their own scene. So like I say here, we could still give Eucharist a lot of credit for Greeting Immortality. I think that's an important song for both melodic death metal and melodic black metal in terms of the structure that it introduced to that style. This is where we get Dissection's early style nailed down, and they were seen by many as the inventors of this style. This is sort of the primordial melodic death metal tape for a lot of people, but really it was used to get a record label, and that was the point of it. They did re-release it in quite a bit large quantities eventually, but there are several versions of it that I discussed here. I think more importantly, I wanted to use this tape as context as to what else was going on, because in late 1991, At the Gates had recorded their first album. It didn't get released up until a full year later, and what we have to consider the context of like Dark Throne's death metal record, which is also recorded a couple years before, and the level of death metal quality and sophistication that was happening all around. Now, Dissection is a very different thing from At the Gates and Dark Throne. As death metal bands, we can't accuse the Somberlane of cribbing much off of The Red in the Sky Is Ours, other than being part of that same death metal scene, which is reaching for technicality and brutality, beyond their influences from the Florida death metal movement. So what we see here is there's something extra happening with Dissection in terms of their composition, the feeling, the atmosphere of what they're doing, and that had to have come from heavy metal and black metal. There's just no other source for it. It didn't come out of thin air. We could argue up and down whether they're a black metal band or a death metal band, but ultimately this was a merger of many things into their sound, and it was very influential for melodic black metal record, or just the sound overall. Not only that, but it got them signed to No Fashion Records, and that's a really fun place to explore if you're interested in melodic black metal and death metal. So we'll get there here pretty soon. So we don't find the great breakthrough has happened yet for Christ Agony on Epitaph of Christ, this Polish black death metal band. We're still definitely influenced by the rhythms of Hellhammer and Venom, and I think that they'd certainly heard Paradise Lost. I think you'll actually find a lot of Polish death metal records around that time that began to take interest in Gothic, their second album from Paradise Lost, and you find there are a couple of odd Gothic death doom metal records out there, and we find that touches upon a lot of groups, but what Christ Agony are doing here is still more so their own thing. They do have the digitized toms in their drums, so it does sound a little bit like Pleasure to Kill or Schizophrenia in terms of the drum sound, but these are once again long and involved black metal songs which have a sort of disjointed rhythmic attack to them. They really haven't formed into songs. They're quite meandering, and these feel partially experimental or jammed as much as they do written songs, and almost like they're playing off of a sheet, and not quite getting the rhythm down with any real aggression yet. I'm not really critiquing, how well this demo turned out, but rather it's an important step into maybe a little bit better playing, a lot more atmosphere, and we start to hear things like keyboards in that start to matter in their sound. Also, I think the vocals started to really find their sound overall. Again, it's another substantial tape from this group. Their first two demos were each at least 25 minutes long, and so there's a lot to really examine and check out there. So it's worth listening to the remastered versions of those demos and getting a sense for, where that kind of stands out in 1992, especially in Poland, where black metal was just kind of a different thing all over the place, and there's a lot of groups to consider there by 1992, but not so many to where this band clearly stood out in a strange way. So. I believe the folks in Dark Tranquillity were still a bit young in 1992, and they did manage a pretty good 7-inch Mooncloud Reflection early on, but they really hadn't grasped the whole idea of what melodic death metal could potentially be in their hands yet. And so in 1992, we do have to leave it up to Eucharist to get the ball rolling with their first demo. And it comes after that rehearsal that we'd heard before with a lot of those same songs. And a lot of it is mostly as sophisticated as what we heard in the Somber Lane demo from Dissection, but it is in a more of a death metal state otherwise. So this is going to read as a death metal demo. That was kind of the intention at the time, and we do hear the vocals are a certain affect to them. They aren't devoid of relevance to melodic black death metal overall as it would become, but this is a formative entry that is it really is the beholder of style for a lot of bands in this range of sound. So we get some really strong innovation here with a couple of these songs in terms of their melodic statements and structures, and I say that they're influential again, and I'll repeat this point quite a bit, because even as we reach their full-length album, a lot of bands took these ideas and expanded upon them directly, and we will be able to point to them pretty much directly over the next couple of years. It's undeniable that Eucharist were an important band at this point, but now we can point to some of their signature songs on this demo tape as to why this is an important band, why it's one we should still talk about, and we'll save, I guess, the gushing for 1993 when we get to their actual album. And again, this is a melodic death metal band to start, and we could maybe tack on the fact that they influenced a certain type of band, but this is more just to get a sense of all of the things that influenced the Swedish sound at the time. Now, another band that were, I would say, more so worldwide influential at this point would have to be Dva Elohim Meth from Catatonia. Now, the duo, they really started as a black metal band after experimenting with many different styles early on, and if you look back at the photographs of the band at the time, you look back at the history of the band, they even said, they were aiming for black metal on this, and on their 1992 rehearsal. Now, you will find what I would say is believably intending to be black metal for 1992 on the rehearsal. But on this tape, they're kind of giving us more of the archetype for melodic death doom metal as from their perspective. It is very much Catatonia's early sound. It is directly related to what their first album would be. And it is more influenced by gothic rock and things like that than it is black and doom metal as so many people have described it. Now, this makes sense. When I was first getting into this type of music, I picked up the first Catatonia record, and it was labeled as black doom metal. And I thought, well, it certainly isn't. At that point, it just wasn't. But I could see, after looking at their image and knowing the history of the band better as they've described it over the years, it does make a lot of sense because there is a certain intent to this music that makes sense in that context. Otherwise, I included this to sort of show basically a melodic breakthrough for Swedish extreme metal in general, and an important tape that everyone was listening to all over Europe especially, and something that had caught on really quick as something potentially accessible. And also we see the beginnings of the band kind of stomped out by some problems with no fashion and whatnot. But anyway, we'll get to that when the album shows up. For now, I think it's really worth your time to listen to this tape and then contrast it with some of the earlier written songs on the rehearsal tape from 1992. Just as a side note, they were peers with a lot of death metal bands and black metal bands back in the day, and you could see that people weren't drawing lines like "we can't be friends because you play black metal." They were influential on a lot of different scenes at the time, and what they were doing was exceptional. So it's worth adding that context into the pot here. Now, we talked about Nightfall's first demo from 1991, and they're basically following through on the thought with Parade into Centuries. This is a first full-length album that we'll talk about, and it is much more related to that sort of gothic metal influence side of early 90s metal in Europe, and it is heavily influenced by Paradise Lost and I would say probably the Hellenic black metal scene of the time, as we can see that I think there are guests from folks in Necromancia and others, and we find that this is kind of like a gothic death thrash influenced death metal record that has a little bit of Septic Flesh influence in there too, or maybe because they were peers or just because. But if you're a fan of the first Riding Christ album, or just I guess just Greek black metal in general, you'll find this is both a melodically charged but also riff-driven record that has no real clear distinction of death metal or black metal. It just kind of works its way through all of those things in a way that is not quite in the Mortuary Drape school of things, where it's just a kind of a clear bent on things. And so I'm not sure they knew exactly what they were doing. They were just coming up with what they wanted to. And it makes for a really interesting album. I think that it gives us that gray area that we're looking for as we define a subgenre as more of a feeling than a hard fact. But it's also just kind of an ornate and confused record that it's an interesting thing to listen to, and there's no real place to put it, because if you were doing a history of Greek black or death metal or a history of Greek black metal, you'd kind of have to put it on both, because this was sort of both not that important but also kind of early. So it's for me, it's always been a record that I wanted to talk about in some level, but there's no real spot for it. Even when we try to talk about gothic metal, it doesn't quite fit there either. So anyway, I think that this is just part of the preamble. I want to talk about Nightfall a little bit on this list because they are labeled as a melodic black death metal band, and this sort of proves it on one hand, but really it kind of shows itself as more related to the Greek scene in general at the time. And I don't see a lot of people touting this as an absolute classic in this style or that style. It's always been kind of a gray area record. So I like those, and I like this record for the most part. So I thought it was worth at least mentioning and encouraging folks to check it out and add it to their collection if they like this style. So 1992 was not the most eventful record in terms of black metal separating itself into melodic strands. I think that as we've gone through the whole exploration, we've kind of been waiting for Dawn to have their sort of big breakthrough, because their first record is pretty substantial in that regard. But Here on this second tape, they've gone with to Dan Swano's for one of his original studios, and they've recorded this pretty great death metal tape. And I would say that it's comparable with the early work of Seance and Necrophobic in terms of its aggression, its just a solid sense of riffcraft. It's brutal as hell. It's got that deicide attack to it, and there's the interesting things that it starts out within the depth of my soul, and this is a key song on their first record, and it's a song that became more of a black metal song over time. It is a song that tips the scales into that melodic black death metal touch, that it sort of echoes some of the rhythmic lines and the melody of March of Insurrection from Eucharist's tape that same year. But this was recorded, I think, at the very end of December in 1992. I always thought this was released in 1993, but most databases have the habit of tagging the release date as the recording date for demo tapes because they might not have been officially released. They usually weren't, and in this case they weren't. So this was a band that they probably could have put out a great death metal record right after this album with these songs because they really were that sharp. And the vocalist, again, he's very impressive in the way that he was able to change his sound and his approach over time from album to album. I was always very impressed with the fact that this was the same vocalist on their later records too, because it's a very different performance in general and whatnot. For me, this is an important band, but we're really just still talking about death metal. We've been talking about death metal for these first two parts because it's important context, because just like when I was touching upon the thrash metal bands who became death metal bands, we find a lot of these death metal bands would become black metal bands. It's a very common phenomenon among a lot of really well-respected bands of the time, and these were, I think, one of the bands that still managed to hold on to a fusion throughout their discography. So you should know this tape if you're a fan of Dawn. It's a really important tape. It's a great death metal record, and if you're a fan of Swedish death metal, this should be just as exciting as like an early Carnage tape or something like that. So again, 1992 was much more about treading water, because bands like Entombed and Morbid Angel were kind of hitting their biggest points yet. This was a year where we were seeing what death metal could do as it got more noticed, and black metal was just starting to shock people with its first big records and its most formative and, I would say, commercially popular records at the same time. So it's an exciting time for music, but not an exciting time for an exploration of melodic black metal. So we're getting an idea of where these bands were going, but we're also getting a sense of it wasn't determinate what direction a lot of these young folks were doing in creating music. They weren't finding a direction on purpose. They weren't necessarily jumping ship between black metal and death metal, None of this, it seems all that calculated when we listen to these tapes, because they're all still very formative, and they're all figuring out where their point of something special was. So we're also getting a pretty limited number of things to consider, because the United States and South American scenes had not really recorded anything substantial or worth talking about yet. Feel free to argue with that, but I don't think like Ritual or Mystifier had done anything especially melodic at that point. But there are always outliers to dig through. The next, once we move on to 1993, that will be multiple parts. There are a lot of demos to consider, and there are, I would say, about 8 albums I want to talk about, and about 6 of them which are more important for our discussion. So this is not the most exciting part, but I didn't want to race through it and skip past it, because I did in the past, and I think that recognizing that a lot of these death metal bands did get turned on to black metal in a strong way is a very important part of context, because their muscle memory was for death metal early on, and that led to some great crossover moments coming up. So stay tuned for part 3. Again, that'll be just 1993 for probably at least 2 parts, and we'll go from there.